All right, we can go ahead. All right.
Good afternoon from coast to coast. And on behalf of COSN's Simulation Education Interest Group, I am happy to welcome you all to the Art of Debriefing in Simulation-Based Learning webinar. Our presenter I will introduce in a short moment, and my name is Leslie Graham, and I will be the moderator for today's presentation. Debriefing is an integral and critical part of the simulation-based learning process. In today's webinar, we will be exploring the methods of debriefing and providing participants a selection of usable tools and strategies that you can use to create your own debriefing toolbox. Our presenter today is Elizabeth Horsley. She has over 13 years of experience with clinical skills in simulation and learning. In May of 2016, she graduated in the inaugural class of the Master of Science in Medical and Healthcare Simulation program from Drexel University in Philadelphia. She has subsequently earned the Certified Healthcare Simulation Educator designation and has also completed the Comprehensive Instructor Workshop at the Center of Medical Simulation at Harvard. In 2017, she will be joining the team at the Brooklyn Hospital Center as the Director of Simulation. Please join me in warmly welcoming our presenter today, Elizabeth Horsley.
Okay, great.
Go ahead, Elizabeth.
All right, great. Oh, this is a little slide submitting questions at the end, and I love your questions. I welcome your questions. So by all means, write them down and send them on. So thank you for inviting me to do this presentation today. I think, like most of us, I've been involved with simulation for over a decade now. In Ontario, in the period 2004-2005, the provincial government funded every program of nursing in the province, whether it was in a college or a university base, to develop some form of simulation lab. But I think what we're finding now as people reflect back on the early days of simulation, we were sent all kinds of equipment, and we were given a little bit of knowledge, but nobody ever really told us the nuts and the bolts and the meat of what was going on. I remember getting everything and starting to learn about simulation, and all I heard was debriefing was the most important part. Debriefing, absolutely the most important part of simulation, yet nobody told us what it was, what it should look like, how it should be structured. So I just thought, well, this is so important. Obviously, the only people who can be trusted to debrief are faculty. I just can't be trusted with this such important task. But over the time, I still began to see there was something missing in what I was seeing from students' reactions with debriefing. And over time, as we began to learn more about simulation and more educational opportunities came forward for those of us in the field. For example, when I started the master's program at Drexel, I forced myself out of my comfort zone and out of my little box to learn about debriefing. And that's how this presentation has evolved. And what I've discovered is now, funny enough, I was on the yoga mat this morning and I was thinking of all the research I've done for this presentation and the evolution of the way debriefing is discussed in the literature. It's gone from simply papers regarding its usefulness and yes, that we need it, now to really getting in depth and the best ways and the most meaningful ways and the most structured ways to conduct a debriefing. So I was thinking that maybe the next paper that I want to attack is the evolution of how debriefing is discussed in the literature. But this presentation started as a basic presentation, and over time it has evolved. So I'm going to cover a few just basic points, some of the really key features that I've pulled out of different structures, different theories, different authors of debriefing. And from this you can take what works, leave what doesn't, take what works, and perhaps focus on something that really resonates with you. Now, the toolbox theme, and I will disclose right up front in the help is close to home title. My husband owns a home hardware. Actually, he helped me set out what the names of my sections in our toolboxes should be. And then I said I borrowed the help is close to home. Sometimes I've done this presentation wearing my own red home hardware shirt because I'm still a part-time employee at the store. But I want to start out with this quote. The quality of learning achieved during debriefing depends on the facilitation skills of the debriefer. So just because you have a debriefing, just because you have a debriefing room and some chairs around a nice table doesn't necessarily mean you're getting effective debriefing. It's not an innate skill. It's something that needs to be learned, refine, competency needs to be gained in it, and that competency needs to constantly be checked and reviewed. And the interesting quote in the middle, and you look, novice simulation educators. I think any simulation educator, it is a challenge. Observe and codify the events, organize the thoughts, meaningfully structure the debriefing, and engage the discussion and promote the critical reflection. And the last point, this is where I often found myself stuck when I was starting out, when I got out of the comfort zone and started out debriefing. You're trying to think of your next question. You want to stay ahead of your group, that you ignore what's being said. So that's the things that I want to cover with this presentation today, is how you find a structure, what kind of tools, and sort of giving you a roadmap and a toolbox so that you're able to do that. You're able to know what you're going to be doing next, so you can indeed listen to what the students are saying that moment. The other interesting thing that's come out in the literature that I've found as I've looked more in debriefing lately is it always seems debriefing was that period after the simulation. But now they're looking at planning for the debriefing comes when you're starting to plan for the entire simulation-based educational experience, because the debriefing is where those learning objectives are going to be met, where they're going to be reflected upon, where they're going to be discussed. The students will have the physical experience, the tangible experience, whether it's doing skills, whether it's problem solving, whether it's the communication skill, but it's in the debriefing where that's going to all be pulled together. So they're looking at now, debriefing isn't this separate standalone entity at the end. It's something that's woven right through as you're planning for that simulation experience. Okay. And just let's all get on the same page with the terms we're using, debriefing and feedback. Actually, very interesting that the concept of debriefing, like many of the things that we've do in simulation and the history of simulation, comes out of the military. And during World War II, they began to use a technique where soldiers coming back from a battle would come together as close to after the battle as possible and review on what happened, what went well, what didn't go so well. And this information could be correlated so they could take and apply it to the next battle. So over time, that has been long evolution. There's a couple of really good papers on the history of debriefing that if you're interested in, I can send you the references for them later on, but sort of give you where that come from. But I just wanted to define, and I also want to put a caveat here, Tal. When I'm talking about debriefing, we're talking about debriefing after a clinical or a simulation experience. This is not critical incident debriefing. This is not debriefing crisis resource management. This is not that kind of debriefing. That is a separate entity. This is the debriefing that happens for purposes of learning. But looking at the differences between feedback and debriefing. Feedback is specific information giving performance to help students identify improvement, and it's a one-way conversation, as opposed to debriefing, which is bidirectional and reflective. Now, you may have elements of feedback in debriefing, which I will show you. There are times when you need that specific information about a performance. So you may get feedback in there, and you may have elements of some debriefing going into your feedback. But it's ideally, if you want to get down to what separates the two, is feedback's the one-way conversation, debriefing is the bidirectional and more of a reflective discussion. And also, too, although this is coming under the broad heading of simulation, much of what I'm covering here today is extremely relevant to your clinical placements as well, your clinical instructors in conversing with students. So, my objective today, you're going to take inventory, you're going to get your toolbox, we're going to take some inventory of what debriefing tools you already have in your box, and we're going to stock these tools. First of all, I'm going to give you some tools for building and reinforcing a solid foundation in order for the transfer of knowledge to be adequately supported. So what do you need to do prior to that debriefing period? What kind of skills do you need? What's going to let that a good solid reflection happen? Overall, too, and this is an interesting thing and interesting in nursing education, I would say one of the most used phrases that I've heard in my career in nursing education is theory to practice gap. Well, we can construct bridges from theory to practice with effective and structured debriefing. We're going to repair learner frames and construct new frames. And that will make more sense if you're not familiar with frames when I come to that section. And our final section of our toolbox is going to be for the ongoing upkeep and maintenance of our debriefing skill set, and as well, how can you ensure that your students are going to have ongoing upkeep and maintenance of what they've just learned in this debriefing period. So some blueprints. We need some blueprints, and we need some engineering schematics and diagrams to make sure what we're building upon is done correctly. I think most of you should be familiar with these two, the Kolb's experiential learning cycle, the principles of adult learning, but this might be a new one to some of you. It's one I've just been introduced to in the last couple of years, is Lewin and Shine's conceptual change model. So I want you to imagine you take an ice cube. Take an ice cube out of your freezer, and you set it on the table. So the ice cube's in one state when you take it out. You set it on the table for a couple of hours, and it melts into a puddle of water, so it's changed its state. You take the water that's on your table, or the bowl that you've let the ice cube thaw into, pour it into a little mold, and you refreeze it in another form. And it reinforces an anchor. It's going to reinforce and anchor the new state that that water is in. So that's what we're doing in debriefing. We're unfreezing some of the preconceived knowledge, preconceived notions the students, the participants may have. We're going to use the debriefing period to sort of change, support change, explain, reflect on why that change may be necessary. And then we're going to refreeze that, and we're in another state and another way that they will, the next time they go out, like in Kolb's, and go out and actively experiment with that again. So if you just said, keep that model of the ice cube in mind. It's Lewis and Shine again. I can send you more information on that. But that's the one that's resonated me with the most when discussing debriefing. But we also need some structural guidelines, and I think this is the theme that's really coming through loud and clear in the debriefing, discussions of debriefing. I'm not sure how many of you would have been on yesterday in Axel had a webinar about the newly updated versions of the best practice standards for clinical simulation in nursing. And over again, you need that structure in debriefing. As one of the presenters said, we can no longer just fly by the seat of our pants, which admittedly many of us were doing when we started out in simulation. There is structure. There is evidence-based best practices to how to structure debriefing. You know, we wouldn't want students or any healthcare practitioner going out and providing care without using best practices. We should be doing the same when we're educating students with simulation, using these best practices. So these are some of the structural guidelines. This is not an exhaustive list by any stretch. In fact, when I did this slide, I just did this off the top of my head of the ones that I knew right away. There are many, many more, except I have an article here. It was last year by Adam Cheng's team on more than one way to debrief. They mention a few other debriefing structures. So, debriefing with good judgment. That came from the team at the Center for Medical Simulation at Harvard, so Jenny Rudolph, Dan Raymer, and that crew. It's an interesting one because a lot of the philosophies that go into, a lot of the basis for that theory go into the other one. So I will be discussing that one the most. The 3D model, gather, analyze, summarize. That was one that was developed in conjunction with the American Heart Association. I actually like this model if you were using it in nursing education, because that analyze phase really relies on you using evidence-based practice documents and like for going through your analysis of what students did. So I think it's a nice one that marries well with a lot of it with nursing education. Pearls. I may discuss this a little later on. This is an excellent model, a little more advanced though to read about it, because it takes 3 smaller models and puts them together, and it's all about how you blend those depending on the learners, depending on the amount of time, depending on the experience. Debriefing for Meaningful Learning, that was developed by Christina Thomas-Dryfurst, who is a nurse, and it's looking at fostering reflective thinking and developing clinical judgment. Again, another one. Plus Delta, you've probably heard of that. That's one of the basic, more novice, plus, you know, Draw the line on the paper with the triangle and your plus sign. What did we do well? What could we change? But I've added the discuss. The team at Drexel has taken this at the plus delta, but they've added the discuss to it because it doesn't mean too much to just simply make that chart without the discussion. Now you could draw a line there. The last one's rapid cycle deliberate practice. That's a form of debriefing that's not necessarily happening at the end, but throughout, where you're stopping, looking at what happened, doing a mini brief, resetting your clock, and starting again. Excellent for use if you're doing things that are extremely algorithmic, codes, for example, codes with new learners. So those are just, again, not an exhaustive list, but this just gives you an idea of what's out there. So our first thing, our foundation, our reinforcement. Now this is interesting too. Again, as I said before, how we got this thought that debriefing simply meant what happened after the simulation-based educational activity. Debriefing starts with your pre-briefing, setting the stage for the simulation activity. Now there's also pre-briefing where you may have pre-work students do or how students prepare, but this pre-briefing, which I'm using right here, is that immediate moment before the students enter the arena for the simulation. This is where you establish that fiction contract, and this is where you want to get that engagement with the students. Now this is an interesting one because, you know, well, the students, sometimes you want them to suspend that disbelief, and the onus is on you to say, we've tried to make this as realistic as possible. We understand it's simulation. We want you to join us in suspending your belief so that we can all have the most meaningful experience. So getting the students really into, getting them to buy into what you're trying to do, getting them to understand we're all here to work together for the learning. Also where you may be dividing up which roles people are taking, where you may be giving the stem of the case the students are going to do or any other documents they're going to look at. So this pre-briefing, you're establishing what's happening here, a team approach that we're all together. The psychological safety, over and over we've seen that term used in simulation. So the students feel this is where they can make the mistakes. They're not going to be judged or penalized. Reinforcing the concept of the safe learning environment. And I like this quote at the bottom. This is going to focus on the process. This is not here to judge the students. Now, I'm going to get another caveat. I'm talking about simulation for learning right here, not for a summative or a high stakes evaluation. Just so we said, this is a simulation for learning. Those will involve a few different steps. But really establishing so the students feel safe coming to this and feel that there's some learning the learning that's going to happen. Now this is called the basic assumption. This is, again, developed at CMS at Harvard, and they have this on the walls everywhere. And also, if you've taken your course there, you're sort of given permission to go out and use this basic assumption, and you can put the name of your own simulation center. So we believe that everyone participating in the simulation today at Loyalist College or at the University of British Columbia or at the University of Saskatchewan, this session is intelligent, capable, cares about doing their best, and wants to improve. So if we share that with the students, and also as simulation facilitators and educators, we're keeping this basic assumption in our heads. And you will see a form of this in a lot of different simulation centers where people have taken different courses, and you're encouraged to take this and put it up on the wall or something like this, that you believe everyone is here because they want to learn and do their best. And you get that established, and this contributes to that psychological safety and the safe learning environment. So now, we've had our simulation experience. How do we begin? You've got everyone. Ideally, you're in a space that's in a separate place from where the scenario just happened. And I know that's not always possible, but ideally you're in a space, and you're also in a room that's conducive to a group discussion. So not necessarily a small lecture room, but a meeting type space. First thing, and even any of those structures that I had on that slide a few slides back, they all begin with the reactions of the participants, whether it's called the diffusing, whether it's called the gathering, whether it's called reactions, whether it's called exploring. It's how the participants are feeling, letting them release their emotions, their initial reaction, letting them decompress a bit. Tell me how you're feeling. Tell me how that went. And getting everyone to do that. So it gives them all a moment to express that, everyone in your group. Also, this may be, when you're looking at when you're facilitating, you're keeping your learning objectives in mind. But there may be other things come up in this. Perhaps there was some kind of mini conflict happened to two participants during the scenario. Maybe there was a debate over the best way care should have been planned, and some of those emotions are still coming into the debriefing space. So you may have to sort those out, and that may give you some other issues that need to come into that debriefing. This is very important. Have one or two learners summarize what just happened so that you're not spending a lot of time during the debriefing reviewing the basic facts of the case. This was a 74-year-old male admitted to the hospital with an acute exacerbation of COPD, so that everyone understands what just went on in that case, that they're all on the same page. This was a case where it was a cardiac arrest and the patient was PEA, but the resident wanted to defibrillate. So that everyone knows, if you can save yourself a bit of time making sure everyone understands what was happening. And finally, so you've got your preset learning objectives, which are created when the simulation activity is created. So you can align those with what you saw. Again, ideally you're going to get a chance to discuss all your learning objectives, but there may be things come out of left field that you had no idea about. And there may be times when an issue arises that was not an objective, but you need to address this. And those are things that come with being more experienced as a debriefer, knowing how to juggle all of that. So, next phase, our next set of tools is for construction and repair. Frames is a big term that's used in the debriefing with good judgment and the literature that comes from the Jenny Rudolph team, but it can also refer to a reference point, schemata, mental models, however you want to term it. And your frame is rooted in your trainees' prior experiences, knowledge, and feelings. What a learner does, so you can see that diagram I have on the left, so you have your frame, which leads to your action, and then there is a result. Debriefing lets you identify what the learner's frame was, okay? And that's what you're trying to do, is see what were they thinking that caused them to act in that way, and that was their result. Sometimes a frame, they might be right on. That's a great frame, and let's reinforce that frame. And other times they may need to reconstruct that frame, that perhaps that wasn't the appropriate frame. Or other interesting too, the student may have done a correct action, but their frame wasn't quite, the thinking wasn't there, and perhaps just a bit lucky that they got there. Or their frame is a little bit misguided, so you're trying to help them explore that. So you see this now, performance gap. That's the other thing that we're looking at. We want to close that performance gap. Performance gap is the difference between the actual action and the desired action. So what you wanted to see as you were creating that simulation-based educational experience, you wanted to see certain things happen from your learners, okay? Instead, something else happened. What was the gap in the middle that led to that? So debriefing is the time to identify the performance gaps, and you're closing those through discussion and reflection, okay? And then I like this quote a lot at the bottom, and not even just in simulation, but in general. Importantly, even mistakes are usually the result of intentionally rational actions. I tested a group of students one time on doing vital signs, and somehow, after 8 students in a row had all said to me that oxygen saturation had to do with when the patient last ate, I figured out this wasn't just 1 or 2 students. This was something that somehow they had learned, they'd misinterpreted, and as a group had learned this together. They weren't doing anything on purpose, so that was up to me to find. I found that performance gap and correct it and close it. Now, another caveat. If you do have a student where they are doing things purposefully, maliciously, that's an issue that's outside of the simulation realm that needs to be discussed in another place, okay? As a general rule, and we're with our learners, they want to learn, they want to improve, they want to do well, making mistakes usually comes from some kind of thought process, and that's what we're trying to do, is explore that. Good questioning tools, and this is what you need. This is what helps you explore those frames. Then, inexperienced debriefers may simply think every performance gap is because of a knowledge deficit. It could be completely something else. It could be an experience the students have already had. It could be something they've seen on the clinical unit. It could be they're going through an algorithm in their head, but you know they've missed the C in the A, B, C, D, and E. And so it's not necessarily. Good questioning allows you to get to the root of the learning need and help and repair that gap. And one method of questioning, and this comes from the Debriefing with Good Judgment, is called Advocacy Inquiry. This is an excellent form of questioning in any of the structures of debriefing. And it's I saw, I think, I wondered. So you might say, I noticed that the patient was complaining of chest pain and his SATs were dropping, but you were concerned, you were still focusing on flushing the IV. I'm concerned because the airway should have taken priority at that time, in that situation. I'm wondering what you were thinking. So you're stating what you saw and invite the student to give their view. And the student may say, well, I felt like we were going to need an IV access and give some IV medication, so I wanted to get that going. Then you can sort of have a conversation about prioritizing and about algorithms in chest pain situations, policies and procedures. Okay, so you may have, I noticed that we were doing the code, the compressions were awfully fast but awfully shallow. I'm concerned because that wouldn't have helped getting adequate circulation going. I'm wondering I'm wondering what you were thinking, and you can sort of then use that to go through CPR and adequate process for proper compressions during the code. So you're stating what you saw, you're giving some little rationale of what you're thinking, but you're asking them what they're thinking. By the same token, I noticed during that situation that you communicated with Mr. Smith's wife very well. You were able to calm him down, and I'm impressed with that. I'm wondering what you were thinking or what experience you've had prior that let you communicate in such an effective fashion. So think about it that way. What you saw, what you think, and then you wonder. I'm finding this hard to do, not seeing your faces and being able to do a back and forth right now. So I do hope that makes some sense. It's an excellent form of questioning. When I did my training at CMS down in Harvard, I mean, we kind of had to spend a whole day. Everything we said had to be phrased in the form of an advocacy inquiry. It's like, what kind of pizza do you want for supper? I'm thinking pepperoni. I'm wondering what you were thinking. So this is an excellent, excellent questioning tool. And the other thing it leads into is debriefing with good judgment. Again, this is a form of debriefing, but also a lot of the things that come into debriefing with good judgment can go in any structure you use. We're all judgmental human beings. That's just the way we are. So you think, well, I'm just going to be non-judgmental. But you know what happens when we're non-judgmental with students? Then they wonder what we're thinking. So, I saw that you kept trying to flush that IV. What was that about? And the students left wondering, was I right? Was I wrong? So, how do you think that went? And non-judgment leaves the students in doubt and wondering. We had one of my instructors at Drexel who called them, guess what I'm thinking questions. We don't want that. By the same token, we don't want the shame and blame and punitive style. I can't believe you did that. I just lectured you on this last week. So I love this. Be neither harshly judgmental nor falsely judgmental, and neither berate nor sugarcoat. You want to have an honest conversation with the students. So again, going back to that advocacy inquiry, you're inviting them to give their rationale for things. And then together you explore what good elements of that, perhaps why that should be changed or how it should be changed. So again, thinking, well, I'll be no judgment doesn't help either. Okay, at least with bad judgment, people know what you're thinking. Non-judgment leaves them in doubt and really hinders the learning. Now, upkeep and maintenance. And this is two ways I want this to go. The upkeep and maintenance for the learning the students have had, and the upkeep and maintenance for you and your skills as a debriefer. What do the learners need to know? This is one of my instructors at Drexel, and I love this. What do the learners need to know before they walk out the door? So before you let that group of students go from your debriefing area, what is it ultimately you want them to know? So you're going to summarize the key points of debriefing, review the learning objectives or any new objectives, and have each learner identify a personal take-home message. I wish I could have you all do that today. Identify a personal take-home message. What did they get from this session that they're going to take forward and use on in their practices? Now, building codes. This is just the revised standards of best practice from Anaxel. Again, as I said, I'm not sure how many of you were on the webinar yesterday. And the Anaxel standards of best practice, yes, they're developed by a nursing organization, but they have been thoroughly vetted by an interprofessional, international team of people involved in simulation, so they can be used across the board. And I think these are, I'm not sure how many of you, but if you can get online and have a look at the standards of best practice if you haven't already. I'm very fortunate being a member of Anaxel. I got a lovely hard copy book sent to me in the mail with all of the standards in it. But you can find them easily online. If you can't, again, send me an email. I'll help you find them. They're actually coming out with a new standard on operations for simulation facilities in the year. But now let's go back. Number one, the debrief is facilitated by persons competent. And I want to underline the word competent in the process of debriefing. And so it doesn't mean it's just whoever's got time, whatever instructor's here, whoever has a course release can come and debrief, or whoever's got the most education room. Competent in debriefing. And when I say competent too, competence means that that's an ongoing competence. So it's constantly, what does that mean when we say we're competent and an ongoing competence? We're constantly doing more learning, more education, having people assess our skill at it. So competent. The debrief is conducted in an environment that is conducive to learning, supports confidentiality, trust, open communication, feedback. Like I said, setting up in that pre-brief, the safe learning environment, the psychological safety of our participants. Now, number 3 is my absolute favorite. The debrief is facilitated by a person who can devote enough concentrated attention during the simulation to effectively debrief the simulation-based experience. In other words, if you're trying to run the SimMan 3G and you're trying to voice the patient's wife and you're the one sending the lab values in and you're trying to do all these things, you're not able to put enough attention into the simulation. And I think this is what's happened to a lot of people in simulation. We become the jack of all trades. You're doing everything. You need people who can focus on what's happening and look at the nuances. So I think that's a very important one. The debrief is based on a theoretical framework. And like I said, no more of this flying by the seat of our pants or let's just go in a room and say, so how do you think that went? It's using a theoretical framework. We wouldn't send students to care for patients without understanding best practices. We shouldn't be educating with simulation without understanding best practices. And 5, the debrief is congruent with the objectives and outcomes of the simulation, but also taking into account that things may happen that also need to be addressed during the debriefing. And maintenance for the debriefer. debrief, like I keep saying, it's not necessarily instinctive. It's not a skill that people just naturally have. Some people may naturally gravitate to it better, but it's not something that's not an instinctive thing or a simple thing. And you need to experiment to find the framework that suits your style the best. And also, when I talked about back at the beginning, the PEARLS framework, yeah, that's all about blending different styles of debriefing. So if your learners are have quite a bit of knowledge about the underlying physiological and background of the case, or they're a little more advanced, you may be able to do a different style of debriefing then. Let's say you're doing a code with some second-year students, and this is their first experience. This is their first experience with it, okay? So knowing how to blend it. This is interesting. We often say we're learner-centered, and there's a great paper came out last year about learner versus student-centered debriefing, and they said, everybody says they're going to be learner-centered, but a lot of the times people fall off the track and it becomes instructor-centered. And it takes experience to find that balance. By and large, you want this to be a learner-centered experience, but there are times when it needs to be instructor-centered. For example, you find that you've got some novices who are very unfamiliar with Just Happened, or you really find that after the blood transfusion reaction scenario, you may need to go back and review some things around IV maintenance. Okay, so it's finding that balance. There's also the higher level debriefing skills, and I find this interesting. I'm preparing to go down to the IMSH conference this next week, and looking through picking my courses, I'm going to take a lot of higher level debriefing skill presentations. How do you deal with difficult situations? And also things like the transitions, presentation of topics. How do you redirect a discussion? How do it's easy to say I have all these objectives and things may be going on, but how do you do a smooth transition between objectives? And finally, like I said, the first one on the Axel best practices for debriefing, ongoing assessment of competence. And there's two tools. I'm not sure if you're familiar with them. The DASH, so Debriefing Assessment for Simulation in Healthcare. It was developed by the CMS team at Harvard. Or the OSAD, with its Objective Structured Assessment of Debriefing, which was developed by the Imperial College of Surgeons in London. Both tools have been, their psychometric properties have been evaluated for reliability and validity. So they both have Cronenbach's alpha and inter-rater reliability and the such. The DASH is a 6-item evaluation on a 7-point Likert scale. The OSAD is an 8-item evaluation on a 5-point Likert scale. Both great tools to use, and they suggest, using that. And the DASH, there can be a student evaluation, there can be a peer evaluation, but even if just to have a look at those tools right now, they're outstanding for just giving you some guidelines about how to frame, how to set up a debriefing. They're fabulous tools for that, just to understand what kind of things you should be looking at. Again, if you can find them, if you can't, let me know. I have copies of both tools on my computer here. I'm more than willing to share. Therefore, if nursing programs continue to embrace simulation as a teaching methodology, and especially if simulation is used to partially replace clinical experience, it's imperative that debriefing facilitators be trained and their competence be assessed on an ongoing basis. Poorly executed debriefing has the potential to result in erroneous learning or persistent poor clinical judgment. And this is one that I like. This is from an article I found. Make it safe. So make a safe environment. Make it stick. You're going to reinforce those messages, rebuild, reinforce those frames, and make it last. What do the students know before they go out the door? There. If you have any questions, comments, anything at all, by all means, send me an email. Anyone who knows me knows that I will be right back to you and help you find any reference that you can. I appreciate your time. This is very difficult to sit in my kitchen and talk like this to nobody except my cat. And so I hope that I've answered something. I hope that you all got at least one takeaway message today. Thank you.
Well, Elizabeth, you can't hear the very loud round of applause. So thank you very much, Elizabeth. What a very inspiring and pragmatic talk. It really was a toolkit that we can all find some messages from your talk today that we can replenish our toolkits. I think it also speaks to the great need that we have for faculty development, in particular in debriefing. And I really like that ongoing maintenance. I think that's really, really key. And so I'd like to invite questions from our participants today. If you'd care to just type them into the chat feature, I will start reading them and Elizabeth to answer them. And I think the first one is really an administrative. Can the link to the recording be sent to the participants by email? And our folks up in Ottawa will definitely make sure that we have a link to that recording in some way, whether it's sent out to you by email or whether it's on the website. We'll make sure that you can review the recording at a later date. Renee Gordon has asked us a very interesting question, Elizabeth. If using standardized patients, how can or should they be involved in the debrief?
Oh, I did a course this past time. My last course at Drexel was all about standardized patients. And that's almost, I guess that's another sort of side one too. There may be, again, depends on the objectives and what was happening. You may be able to use them. What were the objectives? Was this purely like a health assessment scenario where it was purely on the technical skills and what was happening? So that might be between the person rating. I think I actually, you know what, my standardized patient course came a lot from people who are using them in the real heavy-duty medical school exams. So I think they do have a point. It's also the same question as if you're using confederates. So if you're using someone to play the wife of the patient or the mother or the parent or what have you, do you have them in the debriefing? And you know what, if you structure your debriefing, and again, that's part of the objective was that interaction with that person, then by all means they can add some really rich information. I hope that answers your question, Renee.
Thank you. And again, excellent point, Renee.
You know what, I just wanted, one thing I wrote all these notes on my slide page and I didn't let them, but one thing though, really, when it came to talking about giving feedback and debriefing, and this is one thing I want to share from the instructor for my standardized patient course this summer. And he said, could we please get away from the sandwich style of feedback? You know, where you say one good thing and then your little other thing in the middle and then the other piece of bread that's supposed to be good. He said, let's just have authentic conversations instead of trying to, again, sugarcoat. So I thought that was really good, and isn't that what debriefing is we're having an authentic conversation. So I just wanted to share that little point when you mentioned the standardized patients.
Thank you. From Kirsten McKenzie, there's also a tool called CAPE used by NRP instructors to evaluate debriefing, and she's capitalized C-A-P-E. Can you comment on that tool, Elizabeth?
You know what? I've never heard of it. I'm writing it down, and I will look it up this afternoon. In terms of evaluating debriefers, I'm familiar with DASH and OSAD, and those have been, the psychometric properties have been tested for the reliability and the validity. So those are the ones that I know of.
Okay, yeah, thank you.
DASH, yes, DASH and OSAD, O-S-A-D, both of them. Again, they're fairly the same, just little different, nuances in them. But you said CAPE. I'm writing that down right now. I'll have a look at that.
Okay, we'll look forward to that in your next presentation. From Barbara Bleasdale, how do you handle students who sit quietly during the debriefing? And she's given us a second message to encourage their participation without putting them on the spot.
I think you may be, I think then on that part of, your whole thing as an educator, how do you draw them out? And you may be able to, if there was some part of the scenario they were participating in. So at that moment when the code team came in the room, I noticed Barb, let's say Barb, you're the quiet one. Barb, you gave report to the code team. Can you explain how you prioritize what you wanted to say to them? Another technique I read about, and this was an article, I think I saw it came across my LinkedIn feed on circular questioning. So circular questioning where you might take that one person but ask them, I noticed the interaction between the nurse giving the handoff to the code team. Barb, what did you think of how their interaction was, or sort of having a third person comment on what happened between two other participants? It's called circular questioning. It's just something I've just come across recently. So that might be a way to do that too. Ideally, you want to give everybody a chance, and I mean, conversely, when you've got the really quiet participants, you've probably got, you know, a handful of really loud participants too. So that's part of your skills as a debriefing facilitator, is balancing all that out.
Okay, thank you. And here's a question from Julie Rivers. Do you advocate for different debriefing frameworks for varied structured simulation learning events? For example, code versus palliative care communication?
Again, I think looking at there's a couple different schools of thought there, Julie. There may be somebody who gravitates towards a certain style all the time. Or your faculty may say, we're using Kristen Thomas Dreyfus's Briefing for Meaningful Learning all the time. This is what our faculty uses, so you're using that. On the other hand, now, if I was doing a code with new learners, I might go back to something like rapid cycle deliberate practice. Okay? And if you look at the Pearls framework, the Adam Cheng article on Pearls, he actually gives you sort of a little algorithm you can work through as to how much knowledge do your learners have, how much time do you have, which framework might work best. So I think, again, you need to take all those into account. And as you get looking at the different frameworks, you can see they sort of, again, they're the same, but they may be looking at slightly different things. Again, the gas I mentioned is it's hard to find information on, I'll be honest. I finally did one time, and I'm trying to dig it out again, but it really relied a lot on bringing in evidence, like your RNAO best practice guidelines. So you may have some things from palliative care you want to use there. So, or maybe your ACLS algorithms. Another one I just found, another debriefing style, and I just got the article here, it was sitting on my desk, and it was done by Kathy Lassiter, who's done a lot of work on Christine Tanner's clinical judgment, thinking like a nurse. And she was looking at a debriefing style that was getting students to do that, thinking like a nurse, that clinical judgment. So that may be one for your palliative scenario versus something very, very specific that you were doing for codes. I hope that answers it.
Okay, thank you. And here's another question from Diane Elaine up in Ottawa. She'd asked, had you talked about the DASH method as one of her earlier questions, and you have explained that quite nicely. But the next question she has for you is, did you explain the difference of debriefing with the interprofessional team?
Oh, okay. Yeah, again, that's coming out actually in the last issue of the Simulation in Healthcare Journal, the SSH Journal. There was quite an extensive look at simulation and how that's come across and evolved or IPE and simulation. But a couple different things with IPE, again, I hate to be a broken record, sometimes it comes back to your objectives, but what you may want to do, and I've seen this suggestion over, you may want to have a group session, so you're looking at what were the often your objectives for an IPE experience are the team skills, the communication, leadership skills. So you may want to have that kind of a session with everyone, but then break out into smaller profession-specific areas. So medicine may want to do some nursing, respiratory, social work, however that is. So again, looking at your objectives and then doing. I think for an IP you need to have a group debrief. You need to have it. It was a group learning experience. It needs to be a group debrief. But then depending on what the objectives were, you may want to have smaller, more technical breakouts that are profession specific.
Okay, thank you. And I believe we have one more question here from Michael. Is it worth the conversation to debrief the debriefing? As students tend to be anxious prior to their simulations, they can tend to not hear everything in the briefing.
You mean in the pre-brief?
And I can only assume so. Again, is it worth the conversation to debrief the briefing. So that would be debriefing the prebrief.
Right, and that will come into your DASH or your OSAT. I think your first two items, sorry, I don't have them right. Here I have a little chart with DASH and OSAT right in front of me. So on the DASH, your number one criteria you're evaluated on is establishes an engaging learning environment. So that's going to come into that. Did you set up the safe environment? And that could the students hear you, okay? Setting up that engaged psychological safety. On the OSAD, the first two items that are evaluated are the approach and the environment. So the environment, again, that was set up by the facilitator and the approach that they took. So I would think those things would come into that.
Okay, I hope that answers your question. And I think in view of the time, I'm going to see if there's any more questions, and we'll take our last question for the day. And I see that there are none in our chat feature currently, so we'll wrap up here. And so, Elizabeth, thank you so much for spending this time with us. Your passion is evident even over the airwaves. I know I've seen you in person, but it's equally as passionate coming right through to us today. So, and I'd also like to thank everyone who participated in the webinar, whether you have asked us a question via the chat feature or whether you're just online learning like the rest of us. A special thank you to Andrea Pissant and Margot McNamee for all the important background work that goes on to enable us to have such a high-quality webinar. And also to Dr. Baker and Kazim for the ongoing support of the Simulation Interest Group. This presentation reflects the work of the Kazin Simulation Interest Group. If you'd like to join the group, please visit the Kazin website or contact Margot McNamee at mcnamee@kazin.ca, and that's all on the website. Please note, when the meeting window closes, you will be sent to a short evaluation survey regarding today's session. It should take no more than 5 minutes to complete, and your opinion is greatly valued in planning future sessions. Finally, the recording of this session will be made available on Kazin's YouTube channel in the coming days. Please feel free to share the link within your networks. Thank you again, and please keep an eye on the Kazin website for information about upcoming educational opportunities. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you. Thank you.